There we go. Now we're recording. We can. Good morning, Professor Spoon. How are you?
Good morning, Frank. What I thought we should talk about this week is the increasing amount of restriction that we're finding on what one can say in public. Political correctness, I'm not sure when the term came in, but it began to be a very something everybody talked about, and at the same time as everybody started talking about globalization in the 1990s, I believe. And of course, in England, we've had Speaker's Corner on Hyde Park Corner, where anybody can go and say anything they like, as long as it's not considered to be, what should I say, something the police can do anything about,
Right.
say criminal in some way. And freedom of speech has been an extremely important idea in the way society has changed in the modern period and the development of democracy. But more and more in the last few years, groups of people who feel that they're different from others and feel that some other people don't appreciate their difference are looking for what they call safe spaces where they can go and be themselves without any fear of people saying things that would make them feel uncomfortable. So it seems that this is sort of paradoxical and somewhat ironic that as everything comes closer together and the number of the size of our arenas of social interaction keep expanding, at the same time, there is more and more anxiety about what people are going to hear said in this interaction. And one wonders where this is actually going to lead. I assume that the only way and only thing that can happen in the long term is that the idea of safe spaces will gradually disappear and that people will get used to it. But it is a serious problem, and it's similar to other things we've talked about, that as the size of the arenas within which we interact and the numbers of people we interact with gets larger and larger, that gradually competition starts to emerge about who's better than who else than the others, and of course that's happening on the world stage with Russia and China and America and Europe in international relations, but it's also happening in everyday social life. And since I think that what I come back to every time we meet in one way or another is that it's everyday social life, which is the changes in everyday social life, the qualitative change in everyday social life, which is the most important factor in globalization. I think this is something that we have to watch very carefully because it's going to be an indicator for everything else.
Well, you raise an interesting point, and it's a funny dynamic in many ways because if you go back 50 years ago, to the extent there was speech or contact or communication between people or from one person making a statement, it was always rock solid, verifiably attributable. All right, unless it was George Kennan writing his Citizen X commentary on containment, but a number of people figured out it was a high-level State Department individual. Now, though, with the proliferation of communication tools, there's such a cloak of anonymity that's available to people that they can say anything and do say anything and portray what they say as real events, real news, because A, they're shielded, and B, I think they have an ability to advocate a cause or or a particular pattern of behavior, and not really have to get out there and be questioned for it or be evaluated by it. And I think that sort of freedom that's been allowed now has actually had an inverse effect, because the people who are willing to stand up and be identified and be attributable are instantly savaged by this chorus of people who remain hidden, but yet simply by their sheer numbers have a very loud collective voice. And I'm speaking in generalities, but I'm talking about Facebook, I'm talking about Twitter handles, Twitter account feeds. You just don't know who these people are, but there are millions and millions of them. And if I was to put a comment, for example, right now on President Trump's Twitter feed, which I could do because I am a Twitter member, I could put an incendiary comment on that feed, and by 9:40 a.m., 10 minutes from now, I might have 500,000 people savaging me, or each of whom are unidentifiable. They're on there with red hot 123, big boy 567. That might be their handles. But the sheer numbers would keep growing, so that by 11 a.m., there might be 2 million people savaging me. So is my freedom of speech curtailed because of that dynamic? You bet it is. I'm afraid. I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to put a posting on his website. So it's peculiar. As we've expanded our capabilities of flexibility and freedom in one respect, they become restrained and constrained because of the fear of the unknown members of the chorus. I'd like it if everybody had to be mandatorily identified.
That's very interesting. And I have to say that at the same time, we have fake news, which is a new idea, which means that as the access to information has increased at an accelerating rate since the beginning of the World Wide Web in, what was it, 1992, our ability to know what we can believe and what we can't believe has become impaired, and everything has become much more difficult, which makes one wonder. Well, of course, it means that who you belong to, the group that you belong to, that you know you can trust, becomes more and more important. And that, for some people who are in the scientific community, or particular communities of relatively highly qualified people, that's not a serious problem. But for the majority of the global population that don't have that background, it can make life very difficult. Well, and therefore they want safe spaces.
That's a very good point, because what's happening is it's almost a reversion to tribalism. Or it's a countercurrent against the globalization expansion push. All right, in that people seeking safe spaces are going, wow, look at all this. I'm in this big, broad field now of freedom. I'm afraid because I can't believe various things. I have to find people of my own kind. And then instead of perhaps huddling within cultural groups or within national groups or ethnic groups or nation state groups, hold on a minute, they're huddling within like-minded people groups.
We're going back to the situation, which you're right to call tribalism, where it all depends on who you know, rather than what has been happening, which has been our ability to interact and be comfortable with larger and larger numbers of people that we don't know.
Well, and I think part of it is, to go back to your initial premise, has to do with the freedom of speech feeling. All right, if people don't feel that they can, and I'm talking about freedom, not in a strict sense. I mean, can somebody write a letter to the editor of any newspaper and be assured that, I mean, unless they're expressing a threat against a politician, can they be assured that the police are going to knock on their door? Yes, people can do that. All right, but it's the fear of ridicule. It's the fear of being laughed at. It's the fear of being cast out. All right, that's the fear. that's become all too palpable now in our society. And that's why people stay within their tribal groups, all right? Because if you're for example, I'll pick the easy one. If you're a Trump supporter and you're sitting at a cocktail party in the Upper East Side of Manhattan, sitting next to a group of George Plimpton-esque kind of individuals, you're going to feel real out of place. By the same token, if you're a George Plimpton-esque kind of individual and you're planted out in Branson, Missouri or something, I mean, you're going to feel out of place, and you're not going to be free to express your feelings, and that's happening now. You don't have to be in the Upper East Side. You don't have to be in Missouri. All you have to do is be on the computer, and that's that's the game changer.
And I think that we should compare all this, which is our experience in our part of the world, and probably the larger part of the world, with what's going on in China, which is becoming known more and more as the surveillance state, where in fact there is no freedom of speech in the sense that we understand it, and the state is listening all the time to what you say.
But see, it's interesting there because of that dynamic, the tribalism is the state versus the people. Here in the West, the people are divided into multiple different factions. Maybe because of the freedom that exists. I don't know. I'd have to ponder that. I'd have to think about that.
Well, it's certainly China is a state in which the party controls the population, which is one of the largest, or probably the largest still in the whole world. Whereas here, we still like to think that we control the state.
Mm-hmm.
And to some extent we do, except that the mechanisms for controlling the state are very complex, and sometimes one wonders why things happen the way that they do. But so much here depends upon whose voice is heard, and just exactly what determines whose voice is heard is a very different set of factors now than what it was 20 or 30 years ago. And probably that's going to continue to change because social media won't continue to be the same as they are now. In fact, since I don't use social media very much myself, I'm not sure I can talk about this, but I get the impression that the way social media work is changing all the time to some extent.
Yes.
So obviously this is something we need to watch very carefully. There's been a lot of discussion of the information, what do they call it? Not the information state, not the information world, the information age.
Yes.
Since the early 90s, and no one's quite sure what's going to happen next. That is, everybody assumes that the information age, life in the information age, is very different from what it was before. But what it's going to lead to is not just globalization. It's a very different a different way for individuals to interact in the globalized world. And so it's very difficult for us. It gets more and more difficult for us to have any idea of what the final stages of globalization are going to be like when 10 billion or possibly 12 billion people are in fact in equal have equal possibilities of interaction with each other.
That's true. That's exactly correct. And that's why in many respects it's a potentially dangerous time insofar as information connectivity goes, because if that many people can collectively put together one voice or get behind one idea, they could drive the whole ship right off the road.
And I think that's probably why the so-called summit on Monday in Helsinki between the leaders of two competing world powers has got the global attention that it has, because it certainly has very different implications now from what it had for their predecessors. And it would be interesting if someday there would be a meeting not just between the president of Russia and the president of the United States, but between those two presidents and the equivalent in China. And Europe doesn't have an equivalent yet, but presumably will do in time. And that will be the beginning of a completely new way of understanding the way the world is organized.
We've often talked about that, and that would, and it's funny, that would be the G7, back to the G7, and it would be the G7 minus, say, 3 or 4. All right, but you're right, and I mean that may not be that far away. It may not be that far away. All right, well, I see we're coming up to the time here, Professor. I guess we'll think about this and look forward to talking next week. Is that all right with you?
Okay.
All right. Thank you very much.
Week.
All right. Bye.
Bye.